Hey, it's me, Rose la Fabiloca, and we are going to take down white supremacy, one pendejo at a time. This is the Sabe podcast. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Sabe podcast, where we discuss social, political, and economic issues facing minorities in the present day. I hope you all enjoyed episode 13, where we discuss minorities and their toxic glorification of the family unit. If you haven't already, please give it a listen and let me know what your thoughts are. Don't forget to subscribe and share if you care, as we address these world issues one pendejo at a time. So today we are going to be talking about feminism being something created to serve white women. Now, I know I might get a lot of hate at first based off of the title, but this is something that needs to be said how it is, point blank. Like, you see, it's not my opinion that feminism was created for white women. It's actually a fact. So I mentioned earlier in other episodes that there was a time where I had lost my job, right? And I mentioned how in that time I spent a lot of extra time at the library just absorbing information out of fear that if I wasn't spending my spare time stimulating my brain, that I would become stupid. So in that time of frequenting the library, I had already created a blog that some of you might be familiar with, and I called it Second Feminist Movement. Because in doing the search surrounding feminism and comparing it to the present day, I uncovered a lot of things I did not know about feminism and its origins. Like, there is so much history surrounding feminism that so many people don't know about, that I genuinely believe, if there aren't already, college campuses need to have an intro to feminism class. I think that would be freaking wonderful. And as usual, I'm going to challenge you guys to think at a higher level and challenge yourself on what it is you think feminism is and how it began. Because we need to be willing to debunk some myths surrounding feminism in order to get to the deeper meaning of feminism itself. So like I did in 2018, I'm going to start at the beginning. Many people, when they think about feminism and its history, often know that feminism was born through the widespread period of awakening for women called the feminist movement, or also known as the women's rights movement. But now, the women's rights movement can be seen as an individual event that took place in the 1960s, like a encapsulation of a time period in the more modern world where women were fighting for their rights. However, the fight for women's rights actually really began to be documented as a concerted effort to lobby for in government as early as the mid-1800s. And at that time, women were already, albeit, subtly, discussing redefining the idea of womanhood, and were more openly expressing the idea that women were capable of much more beyond domestication and submission. So the most notable event that was where my research began was in the year of 1848. In 1848, two female leaders in this call for reform were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And these women gathered in Seneca Falls in New York to discuss women's rights with a group of female abolitionist activists and a small handful of men. Yes, not only can men be feminists, but in fact, men, albeit a small number, participated in fighting for women's rights. So this get-together in Seneca Falls became known as the Seneca Falls Convention, and this convention held strong to the idea that women were autonomous individuals and they deserved their own political soapbox and ability to flesh out their own political identities in an equal manner that men had at that time. So at this time, the focus was on one simple thing: the right to vote. Granted, they did believe in equal rights in other areas, but at that time, where women were these just super voiceless kitchen fixtures, they had to identify step one and then go from there. So women's rights, much like slavery, has been a long process and not something that's just happened overnight. And the reality to that is this: had people who at those times were labeled as radicals not stood up for the causes Many, if not all, of the rights we have today as women and as minorities would not be possible because of them. And when I say minorities, I'm referring to minority females. So think of it this way. The women's rights movement was initiated by white women who at that time were mostly concerned about their own livelihood because they weren't raised any other way, right? And when we look at the time period of the women's rights movement in the 1960s, that still didn't accomplish what we are still fighting for in the present day. But what brought the movement at that time kind of to this halting stop was when the Civil War began in the 1850s, mostly because everyone socially and economically were focused on the war. When wars rage on, especially within a country, especially between state to state like the Civil War was, there was no time to really accomplish anything in regards to women's rights. Women were supporting the war efforts by aiding and nursing the soldiers back to health and doing what they could. So if we look at the lives of white women at that time, the Civil War didn't warrant a soapbox for them to make their voices heard. And to be honest, while the right to vote was something they wanted and needed, you have to remember that Black female slaves were not being considered in that movement's efforts, not in a mainstream way. And people really need to get this in their brains. Do y'all really think, or do you really want to try to convince us, minorities, that feminism has always just been about all women? Because it hasn't. It's not like Black female slaves across America were being invited to the Seneca Falls Convention in New York and being passed the baton when it was their time to stand up and voice the issues the Black community was facing at that time. Like, why would they have done that? Why? What indication in history for that time period of the white woman's life would indicate that they would invite openly Black women to come and be a part of the women's rights movement? And why would that have happened or been a part of the culture? And this is sort of this low-key form of aggression that has always been perpetrated by white women toward Black women. The aggression takes shape in the idea of feminism and how at that time white women were able to find all these reasons to justify why they should be seen as a political equal, but remained stagnant on the idea that Black women should be seen as their human equals. Which brings me to the point that white women oftentimes want to see the world where everyone is equal. You know, they have this rose-colored way of viewing things and this like erasure of history to fit their comfort, their social comfort. And they want it to be seen where, you know, the world where everyone is equal and so that they are seen as equal. But the reality of that equality, seeing Black women as their equals, seeing Hispanic women as their equals, seeing Asian women as their equals, etc., is something that they have a hard time with. Granted, not all white women, but even the ones who don't hold any conscious bias or racism or prejudice or malintent, even those ones don't realize the microaggressions they or their peers have displayed in large numbers against their Black peers their entire lives. And this is why we see during this Black Lives Matter movement, Black women really getting up and using this time to voice their experiences with racism and prejudice and conscious or unconscious biases and the microaggressions that are displayed violently against them in social circles as they grow up. And the people who are most criticized in that context tend to be white women because for a long time, they were not being checked. You know what I mean? Like, you had to, in the 1960s, Black women would have had to go through the white man in order to get to the white woman, okay? Because white men were controlling everything at that time, even their own wives. So they have lived in this untouchable space for a long time in society where they're not being challenged or highlighted or put under this microscope of their treatment and the social aspect of their lives. They haven't been held accountable. And so in this era of Black Lives Matter, I find that a lot of white women are having a really hard time engaging in social media, engaging in these conversations, and because they have not been mentally trained to withstand the idea of these criticisms. And so they rather just log out and disconnect from social media and not be a part of the conversation because it's that uncomfortable. It's something that manifests physically in their body. I saw a video of this white woman on YouTube a couple weeks ago, and she was saying that she checked herself, had to check herself because she was somewhere and a black person walked by. I don't remember if it was a black woman or a black man, but a black person walked by and she felt in her body this nervousness, this tension. And she, all this, conversation going on with Black Lives Matter, she supports it. She's like, yes, this is horrible. We need to stop killing black people. Like, we need to stop doing this. We need to change society. And she agrees with all of that. But when she's sitting at a gas station or at a grocery store and a black person walks by, she feels something manifest in her body that it gives her this like fight or flight response. And that kind of brainwashing, she acknowledged it. It's this brainwashing, it's this social conditioning that there's something to be feared of allowing other people that are not you or look like you into a space that is normally owned by you. And this sense of like not being inviting. And that's something that I have to say about white women that is troubling for me, is that I don't find them to be very inviting when it comes to the social aspect of their lives, where I don't think that they are equipped with the tools to withstand criticism in the same capacity that black women are. Black women are criticized constantly. They're criticized so harshly in every direction, whether it's black men criticizing them, whether it's white people criticizing them, whether it's Hispanics criticizing them, whether it's Asian people. Black women are the most dissected group of people in this country, and this is why the violence against them is so large in numbers. And it's because of this social conditioning associated with blackness, on top of the social conditioning relating to feminism and the idea of women having equality to men. So black women actually should have very much been invited to the Seneca Falls Convention, because you can't fight for feminism without including all females. So almost immediately after the Civil War had finally ended, the 14th and 15th Amendment to the Constitution opened up a dialogue where people began to question the topics surrounding suffrage and citizenship. So the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, and it was added to extend the Constitution's protection to all citizens, but it defines citizens as male. Then the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, guarantees black men the right to vote. So when this happened, you saw a shift to political access, and it was being extended to black men because of gender, but not to black women and not to white women, not to any women. So this turn of events really upset the white women who had been previously fighting for the right to vote, because at that time, white supremacy was alive and well, and the idea that a former slave, regardless of gender, would have voting rights before them was not something that sat well with them. And this was so much the case that they ended up not supporting the 15th Amendment and partnered with racist Southerners who were saying at that time that white women's votes could be used to neutralize those cast by black people, because white women at that time were also racist and prejudiced in nature. So they figured for every black male voting, a white woman voting would cancel that out and continue to put political advantage back in the hands of white women and white men. So in 1869, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony created a new group, and they called it the National Women's Suffrage Association. And this new group and new name was necessary because they had come to the conclusion finally that in order for them to get the right to vote, they needed more support from the black community. So they changed their stances from focusing on their community's right to vote to fighting for a universal suffrage amendment that would grant all humans to be seen as citizens of America regardless of gender and race, and thus being granted the right to vote. And even back at that time, many people in the black community felt like it was unfair to endanger, or for them to ask them to endanger the black community by having them open their own doors up to let white people, especially white women, in to tie their political intentions with the Black community. And for the Black community, it makes sense because they had, for many centuries at that time, been hurt, devastated, separated, and traumatized by the hands of white women. So this pro-15th Amendment faction formed a group called the American Women's Suffrage Association, and they fought for that on a state-by-state basis. Because remember, even though we're the United States of America, each state, to some extent, makes up their own way of doing things, right? So a lot of times when you want to fight for something, it needs to be something that's done on a from state to state, right? It's not something that we just all decide at one time. It has to be pushed through each state. So eventually, though, it got to a place where both parties found some greater benefit in working together for this common goal for their own advancement reasons. And in 1890, they merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So at that time, their approach changed from what it previously had been. Instead of coming from a place where they were saying they deserved the same rights and responsibilities as men because women and men were equal, the new generation of activists felt that women deserved the right to vote because they were different from men. And in this instance, they could argue that their domesticity was actually a political virtue. And using this stance instead created this idea of a purer, more moral, maternal commonwealth, and this was an idea that they knew white men would get behind. It was honestly genius because it served many of their political agendas. For example, temperance advocates. Temperance advocates were people at that time who encouraged their American peers to reduce the amount of alcohol they consumed. They wanted women to have the right to vote because they thought it would add a huge amount of people to their cause. And many middle-class white people were swayed by that argument because they believed adding white women to the voting population would ensure immediate and durable white supremacy that was attainable through an honest form of casting a ballot on issues that would raise the white population socially, economically, and politically, which sets the stage for their advancement and the way that they have left behind the equality and generational wealth for other communities, especially Black people. So if we fast forward a little bit, World War I, yet again, slowed the suffragist campaign, but it helps them actually advance their argument in the end because women's work on behalf of the war effort at that time was insane. Like, women were really out here during World War I, becoming nurses and all types of shit. And activists pointed that out, and they proved through that work during World War I, the way that they held down America, that women were just as patriotic and deserving of citizenship as men. So finally, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. And on November 2nd of that year, more than 8 million women across the United States voted in elections for the very first time. So it's 1920, and women are finally able to vote. And 40 years later from that time, the women's rights movement is birthed. And this movement is known as the second wave of feminism because while the origins of women's rights begins with the right to vote nearly a century prior, the women's rights movement was a diverse social movement, meaning not only was it white women this time lobbying for the right to vote, it was now a discussion of women from other racial backgrounds talking about women's rights and the fight for social equality. So the 1960s and 70s in America sought equal rights and opportunities and greater personal freedom for women. So it's interesting because if you take a step back and just let's decompress from what we've just talked about. When you look back on what we're discussing and you think about what life was like at the time, whether it was for white women, whether it was for Black women, etc., and you look at where we are today, and you look at what was going on in the 1960s and 70s, not just in regards to women's rights, but in regards to Black rights, Black activism. You look at police brutality, some of these issues that we are still dealing with today, which is why I ended up calling my blog Second Feminist Movement, because I felt like a lot of people see the 21st century as this third wave of feminism, but I actually disagree. I think that we are still in the process of the first 100 years of the second feminist movement, right? So if the 1960s is considered the second feminist movement, and prior to that, the original feminist movement was spanning 100 years due to wars and different issues going on in the country at the time, to me, the work is still being done, right? Because women are still paid less than men for the same work, for the same expertise, etc. And when we look at the numbers and disparities within women of color against a white man, or even men in their same racial background, we see the disparities there. So we are still in a process right now of trying to be seen as equals. And what's been really something pressed upon me is the respect. When you go back in history, I find that I have a lot more respect for the older generations who lived through this period of the 1960s and 70s and were a part of something that was echoed on a global scale, one, but two, was a time period to live through that will always be one of the most important eras in regards to the fight for human rights, because we know today what the results are of fighting for human rights, but people at that time didn't know for sure that what they were doing was in vain. They didn't know if it was actually going to go anywhere. They weren't sure of the future, you know what I mean? So, but nonetheless, they still tried, and they found what made them passionate, and they fought for it. And that kind of behavior is something that is prevalent in our social lives today. You know, the fact that we can get on social media and spout our opinions and feel free to do so is something that was fought for, not only in the sense of the military, but it was also fought for by civilians. And it's something that I wish people would acknowledge it in that way a little bit more, is that yes, we owe so much our livelihood every day to military men and women who are keeping us safe, yes. But we also owe so much respect to the people who lived during the 1960s and 70s, whether it was white people or black people or Hispanic people or whoever was here at the time fighting for these rights. Because had these people and these figures, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, all these people, if these people had not, Ruby Bridges, if all these people had not done what they did at the time, whether it was something extreme or very subtle, you know, if you look at someone like Malcolm X, who's considered a radical in history, you know, and you look at someone like Ruby Bridges, who didn't necessarily mean to do anything radical. She was a child and went to school, you know, that was as simple as it could be, but the amount of impact that it had afterward is something that is special. And to live through that time period, to be a part of that, is to be part of something greater than yourself. So I find that human life and the way that we tend to, in this current time, erase history or only edit certain parts or try to pick out what's important is really sad, because there are so many untold stories that we should know. And for me personally, I know this might sound a little bit radical, but I personally believe that high school should not end at 17, 18 years old. I believe that we need to add a second form of education. And I know you could say, oh, secondary education, duh, college. No. Because college is not free, okay? Anyone who's been to college knows, or even if you haven't been to college, you guys know that there is a much big difference between getting an education in high school and getting one in college. In college, most people at 18 years old can't financially afford to attend college. And either they go anyway and struggle, or they don't go at all, right? Or they go and they drop out, okay? For economic reasons or plenty of reasons. And so I believe that high school should actually be longer than how we treat it today. I don't think that at 18 years old, you've learned enough about life. Though, what I do believe is that at 18 years old, you are more of an adult, have a little bit more of an adult mindset. And so that 4 years, that extra 4 years, should be treated in a different capacity where you're giving more responsibility to the students to learn how to conduct themselves as an adult. And then after that, once you graduate that, then you can decide if you want to do, the next step in education, which is to become like a master in whatever, and it would take the stupid, costly first 2 years out of college. So for people who've never been to college before, if you go to get a 4-year degree, right? You go to get a bachelor's degree. The first 2 years of your study are in general ed, meaning it's basically a review of what you learned in high school. In a little bit different setting, but it's the same shit. Then the last 2 years of your degree, you actually step into your major and become more well-versed in the major of, the area that you're studying, right? And then if you want to learn more about that area and become even more of an expert, you go get a master's in that area. And then if you want to be, just a complete know-it-all, you go get a PhD, okay? So the first 2 years of college, they're charging you for these classes that are general ed that you've taken in high school that you shouldn't have to take again, right? And so for me, I just believe that we should be giving kids at least another 2 to 3 years additional time in that high school period. So perhaps maybe you would graduate high school at like 21, for example, and then at 22, as an adult who has maybe a job, a small part-time job, or is starting to really get the idea of being a citizen of this country, has learned how to balance a checkbook, has learned how to use credit properly, has learned on the ramifications of having loans, has learned the ramifications of not voting, has learned how to pay taxes, contribute to society, learned about the environment and their individual impact on it. If we were educating people in that regard before they even really stepped out into their adulthood, we would have a better workforce. We'd have better work-life balance. We'd have healthier mental state, because we'd be educating kids young that therapy is a beautiful thing that can really help you. And we would create a smarter society by making that a requirement, because when the government makes it a requirement, the government is going to fund that. They fund public schools. And when we extend the time period of high school to this older age, then we're going to see a really great impact in how we interact with each other socially, politically, economically, etc. This is what I believe to be the truth. And I know that some people, probably people who are in high school, would be like, what the fuck? I don't want to be here for another 3 years. And while I understand that, I promise you, as an adult who's now 26 years old and who still has so much more to learn, I wish I would have just had a little bit more time in high school where we focused on, okay, you got all this information about math and science and whatever, but let's talk about the adult factor of being an American citizen and having honest curriculum surrounding that, going a little bit more in depth into American life. I just don't believe that that's something that people should have to pay, thousands of dollars a year for. I feel like if the government wants us to be citizens and pay taxes, they owe us the education so that we know going into life how we need to be doing things. And in this hypothetical world where you're learning more deeply about the moments in American/Black history, we'd have honest discussion around the origins of feminism, white supremacy, and why the kids of color in said schools are going to experience the world as adults with a large possibility of being turned away from opportunities because of how they look or their ethnic background. But see, the system isn't going to teach people within it that it's corrupted, right? So that's why in order for something like this to happen, the system would have to be destroyed and rebuilt into a stronger form of advocacy for all human life. So when we are discussing feminism in this regard, I think about if I was a teacher in a society where high school was 7 years long instead of 4. And I often think about the different classes that would be available and what we would want our kids to know in regards to feminism. And after going through the history in an honest lens, we would discuss how we have to make active efforts to instill not just feminism, but intersectional feminism. So I'm going to close with what intersectional feminism is and why regular feminism is just for white women. Intersectionality is a concept used in critical theories to describe the way in which oppressive institutions like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, classism, etc. are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from one another. The concept first came from a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, shortly after the height of the women's rights movement, and it's largely used in critical theories, especially feminist theory, when discussing systematic oppression. So when Kimberly Crenshaw first coined this term, it was in a paper she wrote for the legal forum at the University of Chicago. And in her work, she spoke about Black feminism and how we were wrong in separating the fact that they are Black and women. So in her words, in the paper, she writes that the experience of being a Black woman cannot be understood in terms of being Black and of being a woman considered independent, but must include interactions between the two identities, which frequently reinforce each other. So I did a lot of research on women light and stuff like that, and they were talking about how Kimberly Crenshaw only spoke about including women of color and their experiences. Although over time, feminists realized that experiences of women from all oppressed groups would be a crucial step towards attaining equality across the board. And in the intersectionality theory, it's broadening the perspective on the term. The theory explains how every individual should get equal opportunities to attain economic and political power. So this theory initially came into play when women belonging to the minority communities in the U.S. started talking about the racism they had to deal with almost every day. And why it is that intersectionality is so important is one major aspect of its rising popularity. Every day we hear so many cases of crime against people of color or against marginalized groups such as women. One of the marginalized groups we see crimes happening against in India is the STs and SCs. These acts of crime prove to us that even though several countries are moving forward economically, they're unable to help the progress of all oppressed groups. This happens due to the presence of one central voice that speaks for all groups, irrespective of their caste and irrespective of the difference in problems they face. So people are like, SCs and STs, what the fuck is that? Okay, SCs and STs are referring to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and they are officially designated groups of people in India. And the terms are recognized in the Constitution of India, and the groups are designated in one or the other of the categories. For much of the period of British rule in the Indian subcontinent, they were known as the depressed classes. So if you need a little bit more like context to that, I would compare it, albeit, there are huge differences between what we're doing here and what they're doing in India. I'm not saying that it's the same thing at all. I'm just saying, think if you need something familiar to you and your base knowledge, I'll make the connection that the caste system in India is similar to how it would be in America if, we have the poverty-stricken people, the low-class people in America, right? Working class people. And then we are some of them not working, which is why they're in poverty. And then we have the middle class, right? These are working class people. They're in the in-between of, the low class and high class. Then we have our upper class, the 1% that we refer to, the rich people who just make millions and millions, like an excess of money. It would be in comparison to if, depending on what class you were in, would dictate whether you had certain rights, okay? And while we can argue socially that people in the lower class don't have the same opportunities in a variety of areas compared to upper class people, that is true. A low class person has the right to go into a voting booth and vote for their interests, right? They're still seen as a citizen of America who has access to certain basic fundamentals. Whereas, in India, they are structuring things in a way to indicate who has access to certain things versus, not having access. So I hope that gives a little bit more context to the comparison. So intersectionality is important to help understand in depth the stance in individuals' issues and then help resolve them under one big umbrella that has different colored shades for each different group. So in closing, it's important to focus on intersectional feminism in 2020 rather than just saying feminism, because I don't think enough people know what intersectional feminism is, and we need to normalize the use of that word and stop referring to feminism as just feminism, because just feminism is this idea that is owned by the women who created it, which was white women. You know, it wasn't for women of color, as we discussed when we talked about the history of it. So in 2020, we should really be embracing this idea of intersectional feminism, and honestly should have been embracing this idea of feminism. But even though the progress in educating people about it is sort of slow, because we don't have that, we don't have that representation in curriculum to be able to talk about these things. Like I said, it's not something that you don't take a feminism class in high school, you know what I mean? So now that you have that brief gist of what feminism is, let me just stress once more how the word intersectionality plays that role here. One thing that has been established over time, and Women Life has shared this on their page, is that women have been pushed into the marginalized sector instead of being led up the path of equality. And that is where our waves of feminism have helped, because we've had the first, second, third, etc. But every movement has a drawback and scope for improvement. And in the case of the first three feminist waves, the major drawback was that it aimed at mainly the problems of cis and able white women who have always been a majority in America as it is. It failed to notice that there were 6 other ethnic groups, none of whom were getting proper representation. And when the fourth wave of feminism hit, it brought about one major change. It pushed towards inclusivity of all women instead of just one group. And it took into consideration the fact that women of different races need representation. And also, it shed light on the fact that ethnicity was just one way women were being denied their place in the war for equality. Women with disabilities, women from economically backward classes, women of different sizes, and queer women were just as underrepresented as women of color. Intersectional feminism strived to fight for the rights of all these women just as much as one would if they belonged to the overrepresented white community. So individuals emphasize how intersectional feminism is a fairly new term, but fail to notice the numerous examples of this very concept in daily life. Every day, when one goes to coffee shops, bookstores, banks, or even movie theaters, for that matter of fact, one sees all types of women in the picture. You could have a woman with partial body function being your accountant, or a black woman could be the librarian of the library you love so dearly. Another thing intersectional feminism does is it encourages men to be a part of the feminist movement. Over the years, men have been reluctant to show their support towards feminist movements, mainly because they do not understand feminism. Mostly, men think that feminism is an attempt to make women more superior to men. What intersectional feminism does is it tries to make men more aware and educated about the aim of feminism. Over time, men have started supporting feminism and understand that equality is the goal we are all trying to achieve. So in closing everything up, the point is really just that, the original generations of feminism have really been built around white women and their needs, and whether it's social, political, economic, etc. And in this time of 2020, where we have so much going on, so many different issues, we need to really be embracing this idea of intersectional feminism, because it's built on the foundation of equality. It hopes to create a world where every individual gets equal opportunities to do and pursue whatever they want to in life, irrespective of caste, creed, race, physical ability, size, and sexual orientation. So as we move towards this more inclusive world, we have to really acknowledge the fact that we have to kind of kill feminism as we know it. The ideas that were created for and provided to white women, that is no longer relevant to the average woman today in America and around the world, but also even to, I would challenge to say, even to the modern white women today as well. I don't think that the things that were fought for white women at those times are the things that white women want to fight for today. I think we have to give the opportunity to embrace this intersectional feminism now, and then give white women the opportunity to be educated on all of our issues, so that when they go into the voting booth, they're not oppressing us. You know what I mean? So if we want to see change, we have to also invite them into that brown space and say, hey, like, this is what I go through. And on the flip side of that coin of inviting them into our brown spaces, that in of itself comes with its drawbacks of trust. A lot of times we talk about this rose-colored idea of intersectional feminism and equal human rights and all that stuff, but we fail to realize the reality of how strong white supremacy is, and how a lot of times when we have historically invited white women into our brown spaces, they've taken the culture that we have exposed them to in an effort to help us, and they turn around and cultural appropriate and make money off of our culture and take what is ours and what is part of our culture's traditions, etc., and coin it and then repackage it into a white form and then sell it off to white people, thus creating this perpetual circle of never really getting that place where we're truly seen as equals. So I think white women have to really entertain the idea that a lot of people right now are going to have polarizing views. There's some of us that are like, yeah, come listen to me and let me educate you on all the problems in my community. And then there's some of us who are like, hey, you fucking known about this for a long time. So I don't really trust the idea that you don't know what's going on right now. I don't really trust the idea that if I sit here and spell it out for you, that you're not going to take that invitation to then turn around and cultural appropriate my culture that I have either had to be held by, or even in some cases been a victim of, for you to turn around and coin it as your own, so that in amongst your peers you can be seen as edgy and cultured and all that kind of stuff. So let's be real, feminism was created for white women by white women, and in order for us to actually take a serious look at feminism, we need to really think about it in an intersectional sense. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and got something impactful out of it. Next week, we're going to be addressing two major topics. One of them is about Black women being America's forgotten pioneers, and the second is a call to action to Latina America. So I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and check back here Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. for more attacks on white supremacy. Have a great weekend, y'all. Bye!